Hey everyone, this is Jane with Barlow Herbal, and happy Sunday, January 18th of 2026. Now, last week I jumped out of the gate with the idea of scaling joy based on my nephew's book, The Science of Scaling. And I had a lot of fun with that this week because I feel like it just opened the floodgates for the way that I could walk through my world with just a different lens on it, right? So, what happened right out of the gate is Sunday afternoon, so last Sunday, I got a call from my niece who was pregnant with her third baby, and the plan was for me to be in the hospital in the delivery room with her. And I got a call that her water broke at 2 in the afternoon. So I gathered up my stuff and went and met her and her husband at the hospital. They have two other little kids. One of my other sisters went and grabbed the other kids, and um, I proceeded to have this spectacular, joyous, miraculous time with my niece and her husband. Her husband is actually my nephew, so my niece-in-law, but still my niece. And at 1:40 on Monday morning, so early in the morning, she labored all night. Um, my great nephew was brought into this world, and these are such in most families this is a rare moment when a new baby is born, and not everybody wants to be in the hospital room and most mothers don't want a whole room full of people while they're doing this, but this is something that I love. And I it's such a sacred, miraculous moment. You see these little souls come into the world, and they're so fresh from God, from the creator, from source consciousness. And there's just such a miraculous moment in this whole birthing process when a new human when a new soul comes into this human form. And there's all of the things that I bring to it with a certain amount of awareness that's like, oh, here's this new soul who chose to come in and he doesn't know what he's in for. And you have all these layers of wisdom when you've been a human on this planet for a long time that adds so much to it. So that is how my week started. And then, of course, I'm the person who, will take, this might be a little bit TMI. So I do placenta encapsulation. I did that for my daughter-in-law with my grandkids. And I offered this to my niece. She took me up on it. So 3 in the morning, I'm walking out of the hospital with a little cooler with a placenta. And while that might sound weird or disgusting, or maybe you've never heard of that, there's something really, really beautiful and brilliant about the way a human woman gives birth, what her body creates, and the nutrition that's provided. It's a whole other level. And that is how my week started. And it was the level of just pure joy um, from that whole experience it's still, I mean, it's only been, a week. He's not even a week old, so tomorrow, Monday, he'll be a week old. So that is how I started my week. And then I'd started some brilliant journaling because while everything turned out beautifully, I had this massive thing drop in that when you are aware, and I'm not talking about just self-awareness, like that is a layer of being aware. Like self-awareness is a really, really important thing. But I'm adding another layer on here of awareness of what is happening in the world, even in a hospital, even giving, when a new mother gives birth and you see the things that are off, the things that are not in the best interest of the mother and not in the best interest of the baby. A long, long time ago, I watched a movie by Ricky Lake. Many people have seen it. It's a documentary called The Business of Being Born. And many people have seen this. This was very impactful for my youngest sister, who's almost 20 years younger than me. And so she had her babies differently with a different awareness. And then also my daughter-in-law and other people that have seen this, you start to realize, and this is a level of awareness that I spent the rest of the week really journaling on, because my thought is I want to stay intact as a kind, compassionate, empathetic person, regardless of my awareness, because there's a certain layer of massive grief that comes in when you are aware. Okay, so I came up with some super interesting thoughts. Okay, so let me just tell you where it started. So Um, this is what I wrote. There's a cost to being self-aware. And then I also wrote, there's a cost to raising the floor. Now, raising the floor is a concept I talked about last week in what the Ben talks about in the science of scaling joy. You basically raise the floor of the things that you will tolerate and the things that you will accept and the things that we have these low grade things. In fact, one of the things that I can't remember the exact quote, but Ben loves this quote, something about you end up missing out on the things that could really raise the floor, like all the things that we do that we don't want to do, and we take a clear path to a lesser goal. We might have something really amazing that we can make an impact on the world, but we're too busy doing all these things that might have some levels of joy and some levels of impact, but usually I think what happens is we do all these things because we think we have to. Anyway, so let me tell you where this went. So my first week was spent on focusing on scaling joy. Started with an intense, immense joy with the birth of baby Howie. So my new great nephew, he's named after two grandfathers. Howard after her great grandfather, and Gerald, which is the middle name of my dad. So little Howie came into the world, and that was just immense, intense joy. There are these moments that bring us that. So then I said this, spending my moments in gratitude for where I am, how I think, how I see the world, and what I've come to believe. In fact, the fact that I can get new information and change my mind when needed or wanted. What I think awareness does for me is it really dropped in massive gratitude, because I would rather be aware, go through all the layers of what it looks like to grieve through the things that we thought were true or all of that. And then I'm grateful for where I am, how I think, how I see the world, and what I've come to believe. The fact that I can get new information and change my mind when needed or wanted. That one to me is super, super important. In fact, I've said over these last few years that I've been doing this every Sunday, I think the highest sign of intelligence is when you're able to get new information and change your mind and say, maybe I was wrong about that. Or maybe because we are so conditioned and we are so programmed, and we've got this massive ego, and we want significance and all of these things, that we do ourselves more harm than good, from my perspective. Okay. So then I wrote this. I no longer have the need for accuracy at the deepest yet simplest level. This one, I, I've this is something I've been working on for a long, long time. And I think when it's pointed out to you in the beginning, when you jump in with, oh, that's the wrong date, someone's telling a story, and you're like, that's the wrong date, or it happened this way because I was there. When you release that, and here's why I wrote that, because I no longer have the need for accuracy at the deepest yet simplest level. Even when I'm telling a story or explaining something and getting interrupted by someone, adding to it, correcting details, taking over the story, I can just release and let go. Like, how many times has that happened to you? Like, it happened to me a lot this week, which was interesting to me because I was so aware of it. And I would be in the middle of telling something, and then I would get interrupted by, like, it happened like a few times this week. And I watched how my awareness of what was happening and the other people and family, this was a week of family because of the new baby, right? So it was just so fascinating. So then I wrote, I don't feel hurt or not heard, etc. I start to realize that it's like, this is such a deep level of being aware in such a beautiful way. And I don't know if you can relate to that. So then I wrote, just amused interest at first. Okay. Observing the human condition and the need for significance and certainty. I think that that's what we're all after is in fact, later in this week, I listened to an interview that Tony Robbins just did on a really big podcast that I sometimes dip into. It's called The Diary of a CEO. And sometimes when I'm on my walk and I want some motivation, or I want something to fill up my mind, I think Tony Robbins has made a huge impact on a lot of humans, thousands and millions of people at this point. In 2019, I took both my boys. It was just me and my sons. We went to Orlando and we went to a 4-day Tony Robbins event. And it was awesome. It was awesome. It was just me and my sons, and they were in their late 30s at that point. And I've always just thought he was a really impactful person. So when I saw that he had just done an interview, I it's 2 hours. It was very, very good. And he talks about how we want to have significance. Okay. And we all want significance. We want to be, our egos, we want to be important. We want acknowledgement. Okay. And then we want certainty. And then what else did I write? So I actually wrote some of this down. And then we want contribution and we want love. And usually it's inverted where we do significance and certainty first. And then we might have contribution and then love. And we should invert that to love at the top, contribution, certainty, and maybe significance at the very bottom. And a lot of this just comes with practice and awareness. Okay. So I wrote just amused interest at first, observing the human condition and the need for significance and certainty. Okay. And then feeling love, just love. Just love. And as I had this week happen in some of these really interesting situations, I just felt love. I didn't feel bothered or like, hey, I was telling a story or I was telling us, like when you have it's just so, I think it's so easy to get triggered, and we just don't have to be. Can we just flow into that emotion of love and it changes everything? I don't need to be significant to my family. They love me. And I don't need to always be, if someone interrupts and finishes my story, and I'm not saying you should interrupt people, hopefully you get what I'm saying with this, okay? So then I wrote this, and then feeling love, just love. And then I said, isn't that the goal? Isn't that what we're working for? Isn't that what we're looking for and working for? Okay. Amazing. So then I wrote this. I've been feeling aware, but intact. Okay. So what I mean by that is when you become aware of things that are happening, it almost can destroy you. Like think about what happened in 2020 when a lot of people became aware of all the lies we've been told and the systems that are broken. And, that is a shocking place to be. And you start to feel moments of despair and on a regular basis, you grieve for the things that felt safe and certain for you and the places where you felt significant. Okay. So what I focused on the rest of this week, which is really amazing, is the idea of being aware, but staying intact. And I know 2 years ago when I had this big government investigation start it was myself and my company. I had a really dear friend say to me at the very beginning, because he'd had some experiences with the government and with some really potential hardcore charges that might have happened. And he said to me, don't let this change who you are. And that was such a pivotal moment because it honestly, the hardest thing I'd ever been through. And when he said that to me, this massive light bulb went off. Okay. So then I wrote this. I don't want to lose the person that I am at my core, my kindness, my empathy, my compassion, and my love for others. Okay. And I will tell you, when someone says something like that to you and you're having the hardest thing that ever happens to you, remind you, don't forget who you are, because we are in a remembering anyway. And it's easy to get stomped into the ground and then just go, well, F it. This is too much. I get that. Okay. And so then I wrote, because of not only what I've been through, but because of my awareness. So then this, I acknowledge these things. I acknowledge that there's suffering, injustice, there's collapse, and there's contradictions everywhere. I acknowledge that. But I refuse the belief, and it might be unconscious, I wrote maybe unconscious, that to see it or witness it requires me to self-sacrifice. I have to sacrifice who I am because I see these. So I refuse to believe that to see it or witness it requires me to self-sacrifice. I can care, and I can care deeply without carrying everything. Okay, I have talked to so many people because I think like attracts like. So a lot of my friendship base, they're people just like me who are kind and compassionate. They want to take care of others. They see the suffering in the world. And, so over these last few years, I have had some really deep conversations with people who see the suffering and it just takes them down. They almost can't function. And even talking about certain situations makes them cry and it paralyzes them. And so these are conversations that I've continued to have over the years, especially these last 6 years, um, that I've tried to have little bits of impact on people as well, to say, well, look at it this way. You can destroy your life, you can lower your frequency, you can vibrate in sadness and grief because of what's happening in the world or to someone else. And now you're adding to the collective grief. So I'm not saying don't grieve, but that's the layer I'm talking about. So I can care and care deeply without carrying everything. And the most important thing I don't want to carry is the frequency. I don't want to carry that frequency. I can feel it. I can really, and I can do what I can to change the situation. But then the thing that I can do that's going to add the most is to raise my frequency. Okay. So then I realized this, and discernment is a huge thing I've talked about ad nauseum on my weekly thing. So I get to choose discernment over all the stuff that saturates me, the saturation of all the knowledge. Okay. I choose to have depth rather than volume. I would rather like this, I choose really carefully when I listen to something or I watch something. And I think what happened, interestingly, because, well, I'm pretty sure it's why it happened, because the algorithm is always looking and listening and all this stuff. But after I did my weekly thing last Sunday and I talked about my nephew Ben's book, he showed up in my YouTube feed because he's done a ton of podcasts. In fact, I ended up watching a couple, and there's one that I watched that I was like, I had called him up yesterday. I'm like, Ben, this is one of your best podcasts. And it's a podcast called Social Proof. And I'll put a link to it below. It'll give you a really good sense of who he is because he tells some personal stories in there. But I was just like, so I called Ben up and we had this great conversation. And it was like, okay, raising the floor and staying intact while you're aware. These are such important concepts. So I choose depth over volume. And with the constant information consumption, it's endless. Like it's endless and constant. It doesn't need to make, let's see, how did I write this? I choose depth over volume. Constant or endless info consumption doesn't make me all of a sudden responsible. Okay. That's what I wrote. So all of this constant, if I'm always watching what's going on, consuming all this information about, like, you can look at all the things that are happening, even the stuff that's good, like even the stuff that fills your cup up. You can endlessly consume, endlessly, and it does not make it doesn't all of a sudden make you responsible. Okay, this is where the discernment comes in. Discernment over saturation. Okay, so then I wrote this: if I choose or engage, if I choose or engage selectively, I am protecting my ability to choose and respond wisely. Okay, so if I choose and engage selectively, then I'm protecting my ability to choose and respond wisely. Okay, if I'm just constantly consuming, that doesn't all of a sudden make me responsible. I want to be able to choose wisely, and some of those require moments of writing in your journal, writing in it, sitting with yourself and staying quiet. Most people will not take 60 seconds to sit and listen to their higher self. Like, even if you hear me say this all the time, my journal, my journal, my journal, you hear that I say that every week, because I'm talking from my journal. But what's interesting is most people don't sit and they're still for, okay, forget 60 seconds. Why don't you give yourself 5 minutes? You would be surprised what would drop in. And it might be uncomfortable for a minute. Okay, so then I wrote this: I'm not trying to avoid the truth. I think what you think is happening, if I choose not to keep up on everything that's happening, I'm avoiding the truth. No, it's quite the opposite. I get to choose what I let shape my decisions and what shapes me. What I'm doing is I'm being wise and I'm choosing what shapes me. All these things, all these opinions, all these things of other people, I can let that shape who I am, but I get to choose my reality and I get to choose what shapes me. So then I said that I wrote this. I have a deeper understanding of the why behind what people do and say. That to me is part of the awareness. But being intact, like I get to stay intact. What makes me me? Okay? So I have a deeper understanding of the why, and I put in quotation marks why. Why, the why behind what people do and say. I don't have to let my understanding excuse harm or require myself to be close to it. Okay, so think about that. I don't have to choose the things that I see. Okay, I don't have to let all these things that I understand excuse the harm that's happening or my need to be close to it. I get to move myself. I get to remove myself energetically, physically out. I don't have to be a part of it. I can still be empathetic. I can be compassionate, all of the stuff, right? I can keep my boundaries and my empathy. So I can have a boundary, but I can stay empathetic. This is self-awareness at its highest level. But it's not just self-awareness, it's awareness that takes you into a different realm of being a human, especially during these times. That's my perspective. So then I feel no more pressure to constantly talk about or act or signal to others that I'm aware. I no longer feel like I have to go, how many, like, I'm awake, I'm aware. Are you awake? What does awakening mean? Look at all this awakening. Trust me, this was me. This is me. This has been me even till fairly recently. The Great Awakening. And I'm not saying don't keep talking about that stuff. Okay, but you really lose. I feel no more pressure to constantly talk about or act or signal to others that I'm aware. I don't have to signal to others. That's like virtue signaling. And I really maybe hate to put it that might sound a little harsh, but when you have a level of an awareness like that, you get to just be. It's really it's a really cool place to land. Okay. I don't need to prove what I see. I don't need to prove to anyone. Okay. And then I wrote this. Then there's this, the big G word, which is grief. Okay. Because I think, I have had I'm lucky I grew up with an amount of awareness on what happens in our world with the medical system, especially. I watched my dad and my mom. My mom had her last 5 babies at home. Um, and you know like there was so much stuff that I grew up with. It was just that was normal, and I knew I didn't have to have some layers of awareness that people have stripped away of the belief systems. But then of course when 2020 hit, I had a lot of, I had my own little fairy tale world and reality happening. I think it's just because it's comfortable. It's just so comfortable. um, Interestingly, right? So then I wrote this. Throughout my lifelong journey of self-awareness and now collective awareness, there is always grief. Okay, I felt a ton of grief during 2020, 2021, 2022. In fact, the whole reason I started doing my Sunday message of love is because I just thought, and I really just thought maybe I was going to put out one Sunday message of love because I was feeling like I needed to spread love because I was feeling so much grief for what was happening collectively with humanity. And then I had such a great response. I thought, well, I'm an herbalist, but I'm gonna talk about consciousness, and I'm gonna see if I can raise levels of love and just that frequency, right? Okay. Throughout my lifelong journey of self-awareness and now collective awareness, there is always grief. I've learned to have, this is really pivotal for me, grief with limits. Okay, think about that. Grief with limits. I've been able to allow myself to mourn, to cry, to sit in stunned silence for the world as it is without letting it become a permanent part of me. That seems so massive to me. When I started just writing about grief, because I think I've talked to so many people who they let it take them down. Because when a world seems unstable, um, it is sad. It is so sad, to That's why I think, you look at the Matrix movie where I think that guy's name was Cypher, where he was willing to betray all of his friends, um, and go back into ignorance, because the awareness of the grief, it's so real, right? So then I wrote this: if I stay aware but intact, okay, I can make space for being both sad and happy. I can have grief and joy, and I can let joy become the fuel. That's what I wrote. Joy becomes fuel. Okay? I refuse to believe the lie that sorrow and despair is more honest than hope. I refuse to think that it's virtuous, it's you know, it's more honest. It's more honest just to be full of grief. And again, this is not saying don't let the grief, um, don't bury it. You got to do all the feel. You got to work through all those things. Okay, but I refuse to believe the lie that sorrow or despair is more honest than hope. I refuse to believe that. And this is where you get the choice. You get the choice. It's not my job to hold the entire world at once. Okay, it's not your job either. You can tune in and watch what's happening all around the world and know that they're going to give you the programming, the little bits here and there. They're going to take things out of context and all this stuff to keep you stuck in these certain rhythms of sorrow, grief, hopelessness. That's on purpose, okay? I can be responsible where I actually make a difference. Okay, that really landed with me, really big. Okay, and because I feel so blessed that I get to do what I do, and I get to carry on my dad's work, and I get to make these beautiful herbal remedies, and I get to teach people about plants and plant medicine. I this is where I get to make a difference. So let me say that again. I can be responsible where I actually make a difference. Everyone gets to do that. Okay, my choices, and pure example, my words, my relationships, and my attention. Okay, this is where I get to be responsible in the choices I make, and a lot of it is pure, I wrote here pure example. The words I say, the relationships that I have, okay, and my attention. I get to be responsible where I put my attention, because that is one of our most valuable commodities right now, because there's so much to distract us. And then I wrote this: integrity on the human to human scale still matters. If I have integrity on a human to human. In fact, it was really interesting. So yesterday we've had a really interesting winter here. We've had a good amount of snow and some really cold days and some frost and everything. Not a lot of snow in the Salt Lake Valley, but I've been able to bundle up almost every single day and go out on my 5-mile walk. And yesterday, I was on my walk, and there's people that I will pass along this river it's called the Jordan Parkway. And along this parkway, it's a I think it goes 40 miles from top to bottom, right? But I only go out of my neighborhood and I do a 5-mile walk. But when I walked yesterday, there's a woman that I've passed several days. Like, I see her every once in a while when I go out and walk, and I passed her yesterday, but she carries this like PVC pipe, and it's like a walking stick size, but she carries it, and I figured when I passed her a few times that she was about my age, and I'm thinking, there are sometimes deer. There's a lot of people walk their dogs, and some of them are off leash sometimes, and then actually about a month ago, I was coming back from my walk, because there's a lot of wildlife, surprisingly, that lives along this parkway, because there's a lot of wild still habitat there. And about 4 weeks ago, I was walking and I ran across a small bobcat, and it was like I had to like totally detour, and my heart jumped up, and I was kind of like, oh, and so when I saw her walking yesterday with her PVC pipe, I thought, that's because of wild animals or something. And she's a woman walking alone on this parkway, and it's, even though it's in the middle of a city, it's still, there's some kind of, sometimes there's nobody along the trail for a while. Anyway, so I passed her, and then on my way back, she had turned around too. So we passed each other again. And as we were passing, I said to her, hey, have you ever had to use that? And I actually just thought she would, she was walking quite briskly. She was walking a lot. She was actually walking faster than I was. We were going opposite directions, but she was on a mission to be out there walking. It was chilly, but it was exhilarating. And she said, she smiled and she kind of stopped and she said, nope, I never have had to use it. But you never know. And we actually stood on the trail and chatted for half an hour. And she's apparently been afraid of dogs ever since she was a little girl, and she was very close to my age. And we ended up having this really beautiful connection from, anyway, I'm trying to see. So this is the only reason I guess I was reminded, because integrity on the human to human scale still matters. Human to human, and I will throw out things to people if they're walking with their kids, or there's, I love dogs, and I'll always say, oh, cute dog. Oh, what a cute puppy. And I'll say this, or I'll just say hello to people along the way. So to me, this human to human connection is so important. And it's very rare that I have something in my ears that I am just going, because I want to maintain that. And that's just a very simple thing. But I'm talking about the deep human to human connection. Okay. And then this, I am aware, but I am intact. I really wanted to reiterate that to myself. The world is not going to resolve cleanly. We need to realize that. What is happening in the world, and it has not ever through human history. And I don't know what that looks like. I do think things are going to get better. I think we're moving through really, really amazing times we've never seen, for a lot of generations. But the world is never going to resolve cleanly. We need to remember that, okay? But I can resolve myself. I can resolve cleanly. Like, think about how empowering that is. I get to be aware of everything that's happening, but I get to stay intact. Me, that is a massive choice, okay? And then I wrote this. I get internal alignment over external clarity. Okay, I get to be aligned internally. I don't have to be clear on everything that's happening in the world. External clarity is probably not ever going to happen. You're not going to ever be exactly clear on what is happening. Like, that is massive. And then I wrote this. I don't have to let a fractured world fracture me. I don't have to be, I can choose to do that. I can feel self-righteous by doing that. It's like, look how great I am. I'm in mess because the world's a mess. Like, that's ludicrous. That's ridiculous. I get to stay awake to reality without giving up my nervous system, my discernment, my personal responsibility, or my capacity for joy. I love that. It's like, I get to stay awake to reality without I can wreck my nervous system. I can destroy my health because I'm aware of reality. Great. That serves nobody, okay? Being aware informs my actions. That's what that does. When I am aware, it informs my actions and my decisions, okay? And it doesn't consume my identity. There are so many people that let what's happening in the world decide who they are, decide their identity. That is that's tragic. That, in my opinion, that's so tragic. Okay, and then I wrote this kind of to end my journaling. Then I actually have some great questions, because to me the journaling questions are so pivotal. Okay, so here's how I finished off this week's journal. I get to be honest when I'm sad. I get to rest on purpose. Okay, I get to rest. I get to take a rest from everything. I get to rest physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. I get to rest on purpose. I get to act where I have the agency to act. I get to act when I have the free agency. That was one thing that was really important when I grew up, was the knowledge of not just free will, but free agency. I get to choose, and I get to choose. Okay, I do not need to be untouched, but I refuse to be undone. I don't have to let this whole thing unravel me. I can still be touched, and I can have grief over things, but I don't have to let it unravel me or make me undone. And then I just wrote aware but intact. This really brought me back to my friend's advice. Don't let this change who you are. So all of the things that are happening in the world, do not let them change who you are. That is such an important concept to think about, okay? So then I have these really amazing questions, and I'm going to go through them kind of quickly. And if you need to pause and write them down and journal on them this week, these are really good, if I may say so myself. Okay, what do I continue to pay attention to, even though I know it's harming my nervous system? And what do I get from staying engaged with it? Okay, do I get status control, a sense of being in the know? Okay, oh, I know what's happening. It's wrecking my nervous system, but it's giving me status, even in my friendship group. Okay, where have I mistaken being informed for being morally positioned? And what responsibility did that let me avoid? Big one. What truths about the world do I see clearly, but I still hesitate to name out loud because of the social cost? Okay, so this is a part of being honest. Okay, like think about that. What truths about the world do I see clearly, but I still hesitate to name them out loud because of the social cost? You know, I think a lot of us hold things back. There's a saying about bad things happen not because like good men doing nothing, like good men and women stay quiet even when they see things. So there's an interesting piece of all of this, that we get to use our discernment and our responsibility, right? Okay, and then this: in what ways have I allowed outrage to substitute for action, or action to substitute for reflection? It's not always about action. Okay, you can be outraged and not take action. In fact, there's a couple of little channels that kind of ran across my feed this week, where they have a social experiment where they videotape on a busy city on a busy sidewalk, and there's a boyfriend kind of verbally and pushing around, look like his girlfriend, and the social experiment is, do strangers stop, like intervene and help the woman who's obviously being not, it's mostly physical, there's a little bit of pushing around. And it's interesting because what I witnessed on these couple of little things I saw is that the majority of people do. So that is beautiful. Okay, so in what ways have I allowed outrage to substitute for action, but then action to substitute for reflection? So you can be taking a ton of action and then not reflect. Like it's a really interesting question to answer if you sit and journal on it in just stillness and quiet. And then this: what narratives do I emotionally invest in because they make the world feel simpler, and even when I know they're incomplete? So what narratives do I emotionally invest in because they make the world feel simpler? Not just simpler, but safer. So you might invest in a narrative that just makes you feel safer. Okay, even when I know they're incomplete, or maybe completely a lie. Okay, how has my awareness changed my capacity for empathy, and where has it quietly hardened me instead? This is a really, really important question. Okay, because I've experienced this at a sometimes a small degree, and sometimes in a f all that. It's you know what I mean? Like it's so rough that you start to lose yourself because of the awareness, right? So how has my awareness changed my capacity for empathy, and where has it quietly hardened me instead? That is really such an important question. What do I pretend is too complex to engage with? Okay, when the real reason is that engagement would require sacrifice. Okay, there's always a sacrifice when you engage in the things that are uncomfortable. Okay, and then this: if I'm honest, where have I used awareness as a form of identity rather than a discipline? Okay, awareness is a discipline. It's not, you can make it your identity. In fact, there's so many people, there's a lot of social media influencers who've totally used awareness as their identity. Just like I think we have a ton of false spiritual teachers right now. There's so much confusion out there. So then this: what would it look like to disengage without becoming indifferent? And where am I afraid that line actually is? Where am I afraid that line actually is? Okay. What would it look like to disengage without becoming indifferent? It's absolutely possible. Like, and if I could have learned this lesson without the hard thing that came with it, that would have been really beautiful, right? And then this is the final question. If knowing changes the rules, what rules am I still pretending don't apply to me? Now, this is where we get to be really honest. We get to sit and be really, really honest with ourselves. And then you know what? Like, practice your awareness without the type of engagement that you might have had in the past. It can start out to be kind of a lonely place when you have that awareness. And there can even be grief around, oh, I'm in this situation, I'm in this relationship, I'm in this family dynamic, and I'm not really seen, or other people don't really see what I see. And it becomes this little beautiful ball of kind of wisdom that fills up your soul, that really fills up who you are. And it's interesting to describe unless you experience it, because it's hard won. It's hard won to get there. You know, like WON. It's not a hard one. It's hard won. And it's interesting. So, you know, I think this is a really big topic, and I would love to know what you guys think about this. 40 minutes seems to be my jam these days. Anyway, I would love to know your ideas and what you think of keeping who you are intact while you have this massive awareness. And there are levels there, and there are layers. There's always layers. But what I find is, like I said, kind of in the middle of my journaling, is that big G word, that big word grief. That one is a big one, a big one as a human, because it seems like there's so much grief and so much suffering, and we don't have to let that define us. You know, really, we get to choose. So thanks for tuning in today, guys. As always, such a incredible, beautiful time to be here and be alive and be aware, but stay intact to your humanness. So thanks for tuning in as usual, and we will see you next week.